This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. As part of our ongoing series on financial repression, I have Doug Casey joining us from Argentina. Doug, I believe, needs a little introduction as an author, investor, and the founder and chairman of Casey Research. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Gord. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a wonderful, sunny day here in Argentina.
Well, I'm in Boston, and we just had our first snowfall of the year, and I'm hoping it disappears fast because I don't have my boat away yet.
Okay, well, come and visit us if you'd like a change in the weather.
Doug, I think most of our listeners are very familiar with Casey Research, so maybe we can begin with you just sharing with our listeners, after a lifetime of investing, what are the things that keep your attention presently?
Well, I think the big thing today is the fact that almost all financial assets all over the world are overpriced. And the reason for that is that governments all over the world, the European Union, the U.S., China, Japan, have created and are still creating trillions and trillions of currency units. And this has created a bubble in financial assets. At this point, about the only things that are relatively cheap are the precious metals. So that's where I'm concentrating at the moment.
Doug, we're going to talk about financial repression. That's the purpose for our call here this morning. And I wonder if you could explain to our listeners in your words what you see this policy to be.
Financial repression, well, usually that refers to this meme that's been circulating that the powers that be are artificially suppressing the prices of gold and silver. I mean, that's the big thing that seems to be floating around in the blogosphere these days. They're certainly not financially repressing bond prices.
I would argue that's probably the biggest bubble we have.
Yes, bonds are the biggest bubble we have. And the stock market is a fairly big bubble, and the real estate bubble hasn't fully deflated, even though 20 or 30 or 50% was knocked off of it in the crisis that started in 2007. So that's what financial repression is supposed to be, is gold and silver.
Few people have seen as many countries as you around the world in your travels. Could you share from a global perspective the developments you're seeing, regarding financial repression in your travels?
Another way we can use that term, of course, is foreign exchange controls. Now, there really aren't a lot of foreign exchange controls that are overt in the world today. You have to declare $10,000 when you enter or leave most of the countries in the world, and this is inconvenient. And banks in the U.S. and indeed all over the world, before you wire money, even though it's your money, you have to tell them why you're sending it and how it will be used, and sometimes where the money came from. I expect we're going to see much more of that type of thing in the years to come, because as times get tougher, and they're going to, because we're going to go back into we're in the eye of the storm right now. We entered the hurricane in 2007, 2008, and now we're in the eye of this gigantic financial hurricane, and I think we're going to go into the trailing edge very soon, now or early in 2015. And when that happens, governments are going to pass more laws and have more restrictions and so forth. And of course, things like FATCA in the U.S. They amount to a de facto foreign exchange control for Americans because very few foreign financial institutions will accept accounts from Americans now because of FATCA. So that's what's happening at this point. If you want money outside of your home country, absolutely, including the U.S., you're well advised to act now while it's still possible. Not easy, but possible.
You know, Americans, so many corporations have employees around the world that are operating as expats, and it's becoming just a horrendous issue for them to manage their life at the same time while they're on these assignments.
Yes, it's actually quite insane because Americans, as you know, are the only country of any consequence in the world. Well, there's Eritrea and one other, I think, perhaps Philippines, require their citizens. America is the only country in the world that requires citizens to pay taxes to the IRS, even if they never set foot back in the country again, and report to FATCA and all these type of things. The U.S. is the only country that requires that. So it makes it inconvenient for anybody to want to employ an American abroad. So it's really shooting the citizens in the foot by having these ridiculous taxes and laws the government imposes.
Now, you're expecting, as you said, further and more aggressive policies and regulations in 215 and further on, more restrictive. What's the end game here, Doug? Where does this go? Where does it end?
I think it's going to end up in something that vaguely resembles World War III.
You see it as actually a military conflict versus just simply a major global currency crisis.
Yeah, I think war is something that has been with us since the first monkey picked up a stick and hit another monkey over the head with it. And the 20th century has been full of wars, and so is this century so far. Just nothing really major since World War II. And what I'm afraid of is that the U.S. government has troops stationed in 125 countries around the world, and this is very, very provocative to the Chinese and the Russians in particular. And the U.S. is provoking the Russians in Ukraine. It's funny, I read in the mass media, everybody's blaming the Russians for the problems in Donetsk and Lugansk, but actually these are separatist movements, and I'm all for separatist movements. Ukraine isn't a real country, and it makes all the sense in the world for these two oblasts, or provinces as we'd call them, to separate and declare themselves independent countries. Are they getting some support from Russia? Well, yes, I expect they're getting some support, but it's really the U.S. that's being provocative here and poking the bear in the eye. It's very rational what the Russians and Putin are doing. I don't see them as being at fault in this. And, of course, this thing in Syria with ISIL, this is another powder gag that's lit where the U.S. is contemplating sending combat troops in there. So it's like the U.S. is engaging in this perpetual war for perpetual peace and bankrupting itself in the process. But of course, the big thing is with China. I was reading in Foreign Policy magazine today that we have generals that are proposing planting offensive mines all along the Chinese coast. As if that's our right to do that. The Chinese planted offensive mines all along the west coast. How would the Americans react? I mean, this is insane. So yeah, I think we're heading towards a war.
Living outside of America, what is the view of America regarding these policies and this aggressiveness? Are we losing credibility as a country, or have we lost it?
The U.S. has no credibility anywhere. I mean, it used to be that everybody loved America. They loved the rock and roll music, they loved the cars, they loved their freedom, they loved California girls, they liked all this stuff. But that's the America of the past. And actually, it doesn't exist anymore. I don't even call the United States America anymore, because America was a concept. It was an idea. It was a fantastic idea, an excellent, a unique idea. But it's vanished. Now it's the United States. And the United States is just one of 225 nation states in the world, and no different from any of them, frankly, in principles. I mean, the Constitution is a totally dead letter in the U.S., and the U.S. is actually rapidly turning into a police state. No, America is no longer loved and respected. It no longer exists. And frankly, the U.S. is suspect and hated increasingly around the world because of its militarism, and it's getting worse, not better. It's very, very disturbing.
Having seen firsthand during the Boston Marathon bombing, the martial law that was declared, and the tens of thousands of militarized police with equipment that was going up and down the streets, it was shocking, to say the least, to everybody.
Well, that's right. That was shocking. There are a lot of strange things about that bombing that haven't been explained, like the death of this friend of those two brothers in a police interrogation room where apparently he was shot 7 or 8 times. That's never been explained. There's so many unexplained things, but the news cycle marches on, and the average American totally forgets about it and just assumes that his government is doing the right thing. But actually, the U.S. government at this point is the most dangerous entity in the world today. The Praetorian complex of about 15 agencies like the CIA, the FBI, and the DEA, and the NSA, all of them heavily armed, little empires unto themselves, and of course the military itself is out of control. So I'm not optimistic for the U.S.
Doug, are you speaking now as an American citizen, or a dual citizenship, or a former American citizen?
Well, I think the intelligent thing to do is to discard your American citizenship. Just as everybody that came to America when it was America generally discarded their citizenships from whatever country they came from in Europe or the Orient or wherever it might be. I think that at this point, carrying a U.S. passport is a liability. Now, in my case, I still have it because we have an exit tax in the U.S. very similar to what the Soviets used to have. And if you discard your U.S. passport, it's very, very expensive for anybody that has significant assets. So I'm maintaining it for the time being. But there are thousands of people every year that renounce their U.S. citizenships for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are because they don't like the taxes, some of them because they don't like the reporting requirements, some of it because they don't like to pay into government that uses that money for the most destructive things possible. All of it's welfare and warfare, quite frankly. So it's a growing trend, but they make it hard and expensive.
Knowing what you've known and the amount of research you've done over the years, what would you advise Americans to be doing today?
The most important thing that Americans can do, by far, is to diversify their assets internationally. The biggest risks today are not market risks, and the market risks are huge. when the bond market melts down, it's going to be a catastrophe. The same for the stock market. And of course, the real estate market in the U.S. floats on a sea of debt. So when interest rates go up, it's going to be devastating for real estate. And of course, real estate is very obvious, easy to tax. And local governments, mostly being bankrupt, are going to raise real estate taxes. So what I'm trying to emphasize is the risk in the financial markets is huge. But your real risk, your biggest risk, is political. So you have to diversify your assets so they're not all under the control of one government, the U.S. government. Buy real estate abroad. Find a bank or a broker abroad, which is not going to be easy, which will open an account for you and diversify into that. That's the first thing that Americans should do.
What about gold and silver and accumulating that? Is there a way they should do that, or a better way than another?
Yes, there are two ways you can do that now. That are effective that I know of personally. And of course I'm a shareholder in both, so I have to disclose that. They should look at goldmoney.com, which stores your gold abroad, and you can buy it electronically, easily in the U.S. And the other is the Hard Asset Alliance. Both of them are viable ways of buying and storing gold and silver, either in the U.S. or abroad, but you can access it electronically. But first and foremost, you want to have gold and silver coins in your own possession. And as we speak right now, gold and silver are at cyclical lows. They're not giveaways the way they were in 2001 and 2002, when they were both cheaper in real terms than they were in 1971, when the dollar was first devalued and gold was $35 an ounce and silver was $1.29. But as we speak, they're very good bargains. So people should be buying gold coins.
Doug, you've been talking about gold, precious metals since your very first book, Crisis Investing, and I can remember your follow-on book about crisis investing for the 90s. From those books, what things did you get wrong that have really surprised you? You got a lot of things right, no question, but what surprised you the most in what your thinking was then?
The resilience of the U.S. economy. It very well could have collapsed in the crisis of 1979 to 1982. You'll recall at that time, interest rates, even on government paper, was over 58%. So what I got wrong was that the economy would recover as well as it did in the 1980s. Now, there were reasons for that recovery. For one thing, the very high interest rates caused people to borrow less and save more, and that rebuilt capital. It caused them, it scared them, it made people want to produce more and consume less, which is how you become wealthy. And also there was artificial stimulus in that the Reagan regime ran massive government deficits. So that caused a recovery. That part of it was very real and part of it was artificial. But for the last, since about the year 2000, the standard of living of the average American has gone down significantly. The average median wage has dropped from, in real terms, about $57,000 a year to about $50,000 a year. So the middle class is getting squashed at this point. But the main thing I was wrong about was the resilience of the U.S. economy. But I don't think that this time around, that's gone, because the economy is much more heavily taxed, much more heavily regulated than it was before, and the government has shot its arrows in that. Back when I wrote Crisis Investing, the U.S. government had only $1 trillion of debt. Now they've got 17 trillion, and that's official debt. In terms of liabilities that they're on the hook for, the number is more like 70 trillion, or by some estimates, 200 trillion. And all these dollars that they've created since the start of the crisis in 2007, they're basically still sitting in financial institutions. And at some point, they're going to come out. The other thing is the U.S. continues to run massive trade deficits still, even though oil imports have gone down somewhat, still about $400 billion a year. There are $7-8 trillion outside of the U.S., and those things are like a ticking bomb, because foreigners don't have to use the dollar, and at some point they're going to come back into the United States and drive up, they're going to buy assets of all types, land, corporate shares, technologies, and those dollars will be in the country, while there's less for Americans to buy. So inflation is going to explode at some point in the U.S. if we don't have a credit collapse first, which is incidentally another possibility that isn't talked about very much, but is out there because of the huge amount of debt. And if that debt isn't serviced, bonds could default, real estate prices collapse, and we could have a catastrophic deflation, probably followed by a runaway inflation. The worst of both worlds. It's a very, very serious situation.
The U.S. dollar just broke a 30-year, 12-year, 8-year trend line on an upward basis. What do you attribute the sudden strength in the U.S. dollar to?
Well, all of the currencies in the world are floating abstractions. None of them are backed by anything, and all of the issuing authorities, the European Central Bank, the Japanese, the Chinese, all of them are basically turning into toilet paper. The U.S. dollar is where a lot of people are running and hiding just because it's the most widely traded currency. And it's the largest currency, so it's going to take the U.S. government longer to destroy it, which is actually what they're doing. So I think that's the reason for the strength. Also, a lot of people are afraid of other places to put their capital. So they go to the dollar for lack of an alternative. But I'm not interested in, I'm much more interested in owning the precious metals at this point.
Comments on what Japan just announced here on Halloween and its explosion and continuing increase in its money supply.
If you're looking for a one-way street, perhaps the best speculation in the world today would be to be short Japanese government bonds denominated in yen. The yen is going to collapse, and Japanese interest rates, which are close to zero, inevitably are going to go up. So being short Japanese bonds is a tremendous way to play it. You can do a pair trade if you wish. Long Japanese stocks, short Japanese bonds, because I expect that Japanese stocks will be the recipient of a lot of capital because at least they represent real wealth. So you can play it either way, but Japan is a giant accident waiting to happen. And of course the demographics in Japan are the worst in the world. They're not having any babies. It's a very old society, and all these oldsters have pensions, which is very questionable how they're going to be able to pay them. It's the same problem we have in the U.S. with Social Security, except it's even more severe in Japan.
Well, if we want to talk about entitlement programs and money that's not there, I think we'd have to talk about Europe. Your sense of the EU and what the future lies there.
The EU will cease to exist. It's really a horrible conglomeration of countries. What it should be is just a duty-free zone where people can trade without governments making it impossible. So it really should be just a free trade zone. But what it has evolved into is a super state where everything is run and regulated out of Brussels. They're trying to tell the French how to make cheese. They're trying to regulate everything. and people don't like it. I was so disappointed when Scotland failed in its vote to separate from the United Kingdom. I expect the Catalans in Spain will separate Spain, and I hope the Spanish don't violently try to prevent that. I hope the Venetians separate from Italy as they should and are intending to do. And of course what's going on in Ukraine with Donetsk and Lugansk trying to separate. The trend in the world today is for these giant nation states, which are just agglomerations of cultures that don't belong together, to separate into smaller units. Ideally, I'd like to see 7 billion nation states in the world, but the EU is going to break up. It's totally dysfunctional.
I'd be amiss, Doug, on doing this little world tour if I didn't ask your views on China. What does the future look like there with these problems?
China, in many ways, is kind of a guiding light, believe it or not, for the rest of the world. Here it was the most repressive major police state in the world back in the mid-'80s. And due to Deng Xiaoping, they greatly liberalized the economy in China. And now, from the businessman's point of view, China is much freer than the United States is. And the huge progress they've made, it's unparalleled in the world's history over the last 30 years, shows what even a relatively free market can do, such as they now have in China. That's the good news about China. The bad news is as the economy's done better, the government has more resources. And they're putting a lot of that into the military. Of course, their military spending is still only 10% of what the United States military spending is. Still, it's a bad trend. And the other thing is that there have been a lot of distortions and misallocations of capital cranked into the Chinese economy. The government's doing all kinds of things there, building cities with their people, and it's very corrupt. So I don't doubt that the banks in China are all not just walking wounded, but dead men are walking. And when the average Chinese finds that the money he saved in his bank, and the average Chinese saves a huge amount of his income, unlike the average American who saves nothing, the average Chinese finds that when he goes to the bank, he can't withdraw his yuan, or the yuan are worthless. There's going to be an earthquake in China. And the country is really 4 or 5 different countries that are all put together in China. It should break up, too, in several different ones.
Back at home in Argentina, can you give our listeners a view of what you see and is going on politically there?
Here in Argentina, this government of the Kirchners, you might describe it as being criminally insane. It's a kleptocracy where people go into politics to steal a lot of money. And Cristina and her minions have stolen billions of dollars. Billions. A lot of it in cash, $100 bills. It's in the trunks, actually. So that's the bad news about Argentina. And they do all kinds of stupid things. So to invest in Argentina, I'm not sure I would invest, but as a speculation, Argentina is the cheapest, nice country in the world right now. I have a cattle herd down here. I have a dairy herd down here also. The price of cattle is half of the world market price because in this country everything is not subsidized, is price controlled, everything is very distorted. So if the next president of Argentina, who will be elected about a year from now, is just not criminally stupid, and the odds are that it's going to be somebody who's more business friendly, I expect to make a lot of money on the land and other assets I have in Argentina. It's a speculation. But I'm here mainly as a lifestyle choice. It's an extraordinarily pleasant and inexpensive place to live. It's just delightful because I thought of all the countries in the world. I've been to 145. I've lived in 10. And this, believe it or not, is about the nicest place I can think of to live. It's really great. Out here in the provinces especially, Buenos Aires doesn't even exist as far as the average person's concerned. So it's really just very nice.
Any clear messages that you'd like to leave with our listeners and our investors?
Yeah. Hold on to your hat, because we're going to be in for one of the wildest rides in the world's history over the next 10 years. What's coming up, I think, is the biggest thing in terms of turmoil since the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution. So, diversify your assets on different political jurisdictions, own a lot of gold, and make sure you produce more than you consume. Put aside the difference, because we're going to have a wild ride.
Doug, thank you very, very much for the time. Is there any way our listeners could follow more of your work, your thinking as it evolves?
Yeah, KCResearch.com. You should go on that website. We have a lot of free stuff. Some of it's very, very good and very interesting. Or go on Amazon and look for one of my last two books, Totally Incorrect and Right on the Money. They're available on Amazon, and I think they're both excellent reads. I recommend them.
Thanks again, Doug, and we've got to have you back as some of these things unfold to get your perspectives and your wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking